Diseases and ailments are rooted in many processes and reactions in our bodies. For example, we associate diabetes with insulin resistance, heart attacks with atherosclerotic plaque, and thyroid disease with hormonal disorders. However, even these factors must have their origin. Indeed, it's chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that is the root of these and many other diseases. Therefore, the term silent killer no longer applies only to hypertension, but also to chronic systemic inflammation. So in today's video, I will tell you about one of the main reasons why our bodies get sick. In 1850, German scientist Rudolf Virchow was the first to link inflammation to various chronic conditions. The current state of knowledge confirms that prolonged inflammation in the body can lead to the development of many diseases. However, we need to make a distinction here between acute and chronic inflammation. Acute inflammation is the type most of us think of when hearing the word inflammation. It manifests itself as an increase in temperature, redness, pain, or swelling. Most often it appears suddenly, disappears quite quickly, and is needed for disease-fighting processes. Unfortunately, we can also experience chronic inflammation in our system. It develops insidiously. On the surface, it has a benign course and doesn't show noticeable symptoms. Nothing hurts, we aren't itchy, we don't cough or feel dizzy, but at the same time, serious lesions develop in our body. Slowly, step by step, inflammatory processes can continue for several years before the first symptoms appear. For this reason, chronic inflammation is referred to as a silent killer. To start with, let's explain what inflammation is. Well, it's the body's defensive response to the appearance of a threat. For example, if there is a bacterial or viral infection, or if other pathogens invade our body, the immune system is mobilized. It recognizes the site of infection or tissue damage and directs immune cells towards it, such as leukocytes, phagocytes, mast cells, and macrophages. Harmful particles are then engulfed and neutralized or directly killed due to the release of bactericidal or cytotoxic substances. Of course, the whole process is much more complicated, but without going into excessive detail, these defensive mechanisms often manifest themselves through pain, redness, and swelling. Figuratively speaking, we can say that inflammation is a battlefield. We have an intruder on one side and our immune cells on the other. When the immune system gets rid of the threat, the inflammatory reaction is quieted and then finally extinguished. Everything returns to normal. Unfortunately, there are two other possible outcomes. Either the foreign particle is not removed, or the immune system for some reason becomes too active and begins to destroy the healthy tissues of its own body. By this, I mostly mean autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis or systemic lupus erythematosus. There are the events leading to prolonged inflammation, otherwise known as chronic inflammation. Of course, it is important to be aware that inflammation doesn't come from nowhere. As I mentioned before, it can be caused by bacteria and viruses. However, there are many more factors that can lead to chronic inflammation. Some of them include fungi, molds, and parasites. Apart from that, prolonged inflammation can be caused by exposing our body to pollutants present in the air and the water. The risk is also increased by smoking, long-term stress, sleep problems, alcohol abuse, as well as obesity. Of course, a poor diet can also lead to chronic inflammation. Foods with a pro-inflammatory effect primarily include refined grain products such as white bread, white rice, and wet flour-based products. The pro-inflammatory effect can also be triggered by consuming large amounts of highly processed red meat such as sausages and canned meats. Developing inflammation is facilitated by simple sugars, primarily found in sweetened beverages and candy. This includes all products containing fructose, such as glucose-fructose syrup. Inflammation can also be triggered by trans fats, which are found in hydrogenated oils, margarines, confectionery, such as donuts and cookies, and foods that have been fried for a long time or multiple times in the same portion of fat. If you find the phrase partially hydrogenated anywhere on the product's ingredient list, you can expect the presence of trans fats. Therefore, it is best to avoid these products completely in order to protect yourself from inflammation. At this point, I must emphasize one thing. It's not guaranteed that inflammation will appear in every person as a result of, for instance, poor diet. A great deal depends on our overall health or age. Nevertheless, no matter how healthy we might be, every factor I mentioned increases the risk of developing inflammation to varying degree. As I mentioned earlier, more and more scientific evidence indicates that chronic inflammation contributes to the development of many diseases. For example, Rosanna Rizquez, a specialist in inflammatory processes at the University of Washington, said that chronic inflammation is related to each stage of tumorigenesis, namely initiation, promotion, invasion, and metastasis. She explained that the initial process involves damage to DNA, our genetic material, caused by reactive oxygen species produced by overreactive immune cells. Research conducted in Milan, Italy also suggests that inflammatory environment is essential for the formation of all cancers, as the presence of pro-inflammatory proteins facilitates the proliferation, growth, and survival of cancer cells. Another important group of diseases in which chronic inflammation is involved are disorders associated with damage to the central nervous system. Researchers at the Planck Institute for Biological Studies in Berlin have shown that in addition to genetic and environmental factors, inflammation may be involved in the development of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Scientists have also repeatedly shown that chronic inflammatory diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus erythematosus, periodontitis, and atopic dermatitis increase the risk of developing cardiovascular conditions. Individuals who suffer from chronic inflammation are at a higher risk of myocardial infarction, a stroke, peripheral artery disease, and heart failure. Additionally, inflammation can worsen the course of many pre-existing diseases. For example, it can cause damage to blood vessels and the growth of atherosclerotic plaques, which is the main cause of heart attacks and strokes. As a curiosity, in 2008, a study was conducted, known by the acronym JUPITER. It showed that treatment with statins reduced the number of heart attacks and strokes for elderly people without elevated blood cholesterol levels, but with a high concentration of inflammatory molecules. This was due to the anti-inflammatory effect of statins. It turns out that inflammation, not cholesterol, is often the main culprit. In another study, researchers noted that anti-inflammatory therapy reduced the likelihood of heart attacks or strokes by 15%, which is very high. Inflammation is also a conducive environment for the onset of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Current knowledge shows that ongoing inflammation activates certain proteins which disrupt insulin signaling pathways. As a result, our body tissues become less sensitive to insulin. We have scientific evidence suggesting that the use of anti-inflammatory agents can improve glycemia, thus favorably regulating blood sugar levels as well as enhancing pancreatic cell function and alleviating insulin resistance. These data confirm that by using, let's call it anti-inflammatory therapy, we can largely prevent or alleviate many diseases. Of course, inflammation is a substrate for the development of many other diseases, such as neurodegenerative conditions, such as Alzheimer's, respiratory conditions like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, liver or kidney diseases, including non-alcoholic steatohepatitis and end-stage renal disease, gastrointestinal diseases, and osteoarthritis. At the same time, it should be emphasized that the mere presence of these diseases also enhances the appearance of inflammation. Sometimes the relationship between inflammation and various conditions is similar to a famous cause and effect dilemma. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? I think the question can be answered this way. Inflammation leads to the development of many conditions, but it is not the only cause. When diseases appear for other reasons, they in turn intensify inflammation. So in a way, it's both the cause and the effect of many diseases. Given this, it can be said that inflammation is associated with almost every disease and has a major influence on the progression of the disease. Therefore, it is worth taking steps to reduce chronic inflammation. This can be done effectively by following an anti-inflammatory diet, which I will now discuss. I would like to pause for a moment and make a small request. If you find my videos helpful and would like to help this channel grow, please consider subscribing and, if possible, also clicking the bell icon next to it. That way you won't miss any valuable videos. Thank you very much, and now let's get back to the topic. An anti-inflammatory diet is based on products that are processed as little as possible. No wonder, the more processed a product is, the more its beneficial nutrients are depleted. As the name suggests, this type of diet is particularly rich in products with proven anti-inflammatory properties. In view of this, one of the main components should be raw or lightly cooked vegetables. In an anti-inflammatory diet, we should also devote a lot of space to selected herbs, nuts, seeds, some vegetable oils, as well as oily sea fish. We would do well to diversify the menu with fresh fruits and unprocessed whole grain cereal products, although they are not the most important components of this diet. Additionally, we should limit the intake of the products I mentioned earlier: simple sugars, trans fats, refined cereals, and highly processed red meat, as these all have inflammatory properties. You can distinguish products particularly worth your attention due to their well-documented anti-inflammatory properties. Let's briefly discuss the most important of them. A product with proven anti-inflammatory effects is the tomato. It contains lycopene, a powerful antioxidant belonging to the carotenoid group. Among many other anti-inflammatory effects, lycopene inhibits the release of pro-inflammatory molecules in our body. Additionally, it stimulates the death of overactive immune cells. Unlike many other vegetables, tomatoes are best consumed in processed form, as I've discussed in my other videos. This is because lycopene is much better absorbed by our digestive tract when processed, for instance through cooking. That's why it's a good idea to include tomato soup, tomato sauce, or tomato puree in your anti-inflammatory diet. Another vegetable that can help quench ongoing inflammation is broccoli, and especially broccoli sprouts. This is because they are rich in sulforaphane, a compound with very high biological activity. In addition to its anti-inflammatory effect, it helps protect our bodies from free radical damage, supports detoxification processes, and prevents the proliferation of cancer cells. In my videos, I mentioned that herbs also exhibit anti-inflammatory properties. Even though we typically use them in small amounts, we can still benefit greatly from consuming them. The data show unequivocally that the phytochemicals in herbs have the ability to lower levels of pro-inflammatory substances, such as C-reactive protein or CRP, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. Researchers noted that turmeric has the ability to relieve joint inflammation. Ginger and cinnamon also show similar effects, and fenugreek also has anti-inflammatory properties which can be used, for example, in the form of an infusion. When discussing an anti-inflammatory diet, it is impossible to overlook oily sea fish. They are a very good source of omega-3 fatty acids, which have strong anti-inflammatory properties. In one of the many studies on the subject, the authors noted that the consumption of omega-3 fatty acids caused an inhibition of pro-inflammatory molecules in patients with active Crohn's disease. Researchers at the Ohio Institute of Behavioral Medicine also presented some interesting findings. They proved that the use of omega-3 fatty acids can reduce inflammation even in healthy people. At this point, let me remind you of what I said earlier. Chronic inflammation often does not show any symptoms, so we feel healthy, but adverse changes occur at the cellular level during this time. And so, as scientists have shown, we don't have to suffer any ailments for omega-3 fatty acids to quietly suppress the developing inflammation. Here I would like to add that natural sources of omega-3 fatty acids are mainly fish, such as wild Pacific salmon, sardines, and herring. Fat from the right sources can be our ally in the fight against chronic inflammation. This is proven by certain vegetable oils, in particular black cumin oil, but also many others. Results of a study published in 2016 showed that consumption of Nigella sativa oil can alleviate inflammation and reduce oxidative stress in people struggling with rheumatoid arthritis. Evening primrose oil and borage seed oil also demonstrate anti-inflammatory effects. They owe these properties to the presence of alpha-gamma linolenic acid from the omega-3 family. In one scientific paper, I found information that in order to suppress inflammatory processes, we can combine any of these oils with omega-3 fatty acids. This only confirms that anti-inflammatory diet should consist of many different products and should not be based on single ingredients. Here, I would also like to add that it's worth adding extra virgin olive oil to your menu from time to time. As evidenced by recent literature, regular use of olive oil reduces the level of pro-inflammatory molecules in our body. Good news for people who like fruits. These products have also been shown to have anti-inflammatory effects. Cherries and tart cherry juice are particularly interesting in this regard. In a recent scientific study, it was confirmed that drinking cherry juice regularly reduces the amount of C-reactive protein, or CRP. This proves that cherries are a valuable dietary ingredient in the fight against chronic inflammation. Avocados are also among fruits with anti-inflammatory properties. An interesting study on this topic was conducted in the United States. The researchers checked the level of pro-inflammatory compounds in their subjects after eating a hamburger. As expected, the amount of inflammation-causing compounds increased. However, when the study volunteers were also given avocado with the meal, no increase in pro-inflammatory factors occurred. We can draw two conclusions from this experiment. First, avocado has anti-inflammatory properties, and second, if we are tempted to reach for an unhealthy product, it is worth adding some ingredients with beneficial properties. When discussing fruits with anti-inflammatory effects, we can't omit berries. Primarily, I am thinking of blueberries, strawberries, and raspberries. Numerous studies have shown that consuming these fruits can relieve inflammation in people with osteoarthritis, type 2 diabetes, or abdominal obesity, among others. People who would like to reduce chronic inflammation should also consider including high-quality, unsweetened cocoa in their diet. It is a product rich in polyphenols, which have strong antioxidant properties. A reputable journal published a study showing that the consumption of cocoa can be associated with a reduction in the levels of compounds causing inflammation. This effect was observed in patients found to be at a high risk of developing a cardiovascular condition. There is also a place for almonds in an anti-inflammatory diet. While searching for materials for this video, I found a study which showed that enriching our menu with almonds results in lower levels of pro-inflammatory factors in people with type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. Apart from almonds, other seeds with proven anti-inflammatory properties are flax seeds or linseeds. In a study on subjects diagnosed with coronary artery disease, it was observed that consuming 30 grams of flaxseed per day resulted in a reduction in pro-inflammatory compounds, including CRP, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF for short. Therefore, it would be a good idea to add flaxseed to our oatmeal or natural yogurt or prepare flaxseed pudding. With today's video, I wanted to show you that the absence of concerning symptoms doesn't mean that there are no pathological changes insidiously developing in our body. That's why it is so important to apply the right diet regardless of our current health. Recently, the so-called anti-inflammatory diet has become increasingly popular. And I am happy to admit that in this case popularity goes hand in hand with science. Many studies have shown that following an anti-inflammatory diet reduces the risk of developing not only various types of cancer, but also depression, cardiovascular diseases, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or type 2 diabetes. It also alleviates the course of typically inflammatory conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis. What I would like you to take away from this material is that the best effect for our health can be achieved by approaching the diet comprehensively. This means reaching for many different beneficial products, not just one or two of them. Please let me know in the comments below if you have any experience with chronic inflammation. I also encourage you to watch another video on my channel in which I discuss one of the products I mentioned here, flax seeds. In that video, which should be visible on the screen right now, I talk about easy and healthy flaxseed snacks. That's all for today. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.